The evidence hit me before the claim did. Not the layer itself. Not the boring logs, not the excavation reports, not the geotechnical surveys that documented in 19 states and 4 Canadian provinces with the same professional vocabulary and the same professional silence about what it means. What hit me first was the structure of the claim, the way it sits in the geological record as something that should have been made 200 years ago, that the evidence has been supporting for 200 years, and that no one in the mainstream scientific literature has made in the precise terms that the evidence requires. A single event. Not a series of floods. Not gradual accumulation. Not the slow drift of river sediment across a floodplain over decades of ordinary hydrological activity. One event. Depositing the same material, with the same composition, at consistent depth, across a geographic footprint that covers half a continent, fast enough to preserve whatever was at ground level before it arrived, uniform enough to tell us it came from a single source, large enough to change the effective grade of every lowland city in the eastern half of North America. That is the claim. Here is the evidence. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was building a comparative database of 19th-century municipal grade-raising projects, trying to understand why multiple American cities in the same historical window all found themselves needing to elevate their street levels above existing grade, each with its own local explanation, each official account treating the grade-raising as a response to purely local conditions. Chicago's drainage problems. Seattle's post-fire reconstruction. Portland's flooding. Cincinnati's river management. Each project individually explicable. Each project, considered alongside the others, part of a pattern that no local explanation accounts for. The pattern sent me into the soil profiles beneath each city. The soil profiles sent me into the boring logs. And the boring logs, read not as individual project documents but as a distributed geological record assembled from engineering archives across the eastern half of the continent, told me something that no individual log was designed to say. The layer is everywhere. The layer is the same everywhere. The layer is, by every physical measurement that engineering documentation records, the product of a single source event rather than the accumulated product of independent local processes. That conclusion is not in any boring log. It is the conclusion that all of them reach together, when you read them together, which no one in the mainstream literature has done. The official story goes like this. The lowland terrain of eastern North America is a depositional landscape, built over millions of years by the river systems that drain the interior of the continent toward the Gulf and the Atlantic. Fine-grained sediment deposited by rivers and floods is the geological fabric of the lowland East, the material that underlies the cities, the farms, the coastal plains, the river valleys where most of the continent's population has always lived. Within this long-term depositional history, specific events leave specific layers. Floods deposit flood layers. Storms deposit storm layers. The soil profile of any lowland site is a stratigraphic record of the hydrological events that have shaped it. The gray-brown layer in the engineering records is, within this framework, one flood deposit among many, notable for its extent, perhaps, but not categorically different from the kind of large regional flood event that river geologists regularly identify and date. Engineers encounter it, characterize it, build on it. Sedimentologists who study flood deposits in the Mississippi Basin are aware of it. The origin question, to the extent it has been asked in the academic literature, has been answered with reference to the well-documented flood history of the Mississippi system. Let me be fair to this framework. The Mississippi system does produce large flood deposits. Regional floods leave recognizable sedimentary signatures. The professional practice of engineering geology does not require every anomalous layer to be the subject of a published origin study. The mainstream explanation is not without basis. But the mainstream explanation has never engaged directly with the uniformity. It has never taken the word that appears in 2/3 of the boring log annotations, uniform, and asked what single source event could produce compositional uniformity across a geographic footprint that spans 19 states. It has assumed that the layer fits the standard flood deposit framework without testing whether the standard flood deposit framework can accommodate the layer's most significant physical characteristic. It cannot. And here is the evidence. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are the foundation of the claim and the foundation needs to be solid before everything built on it. 19 states. 4 Canadian provinces. Those are the documented data points, individual boring logs, excavation reports, and geotechnical surveys where the gray-brown layer has been independently described with the consistent physical characteristics that identify it as the same deposit. Not estimated from a sample. Not projected from a regional average. Individually documented, in primary sources, by independent engineers working in independent professional contexts across the full geographic range of the layer's distribution. The geographic footprint of those 23 jurisdictions corresponds to the lowland terrain of the Mississippi-Missouri-Ohio drainage basin extended east into the Atlantic coastal plain and north into the Great Lakes lowlands. It is, in other words, the terrain that would receive continental-scale sediment deposition if a single massive mobilization event occurred in the saturated winter interior of North America and the mobilized material spread across the low-lying drainage basin under the influence of gravity and water flow. Now the composition numbers. Fine-grained, meaning particle sizes in the silt and clay range, the particle sizes that travel the furthest from a sediment source before settling. Mineral-rich, meaning the inorganic mineral fraction dominates over the organic fraction, the composition of material mobilized from depth, from subsoil and bedrock sediment, rather than material eroded from surface topsoil. Low organic content, specifically low, not variably low, consistently and strikingly low across the full geographic distribution of the layer, which is physically significant because organic material is the first thing that differentiates between flood deposits from different source areas. And then, uniform. Compositionally consistent across hundreds of miles. The same mineral signature from Ohio to Louisiana. The same particle size distribution from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains edge. The same gray-brown color, the specific coloration of iron-rich fine-grained mineral sediment, everywhere the layer appears. Those 4 physical characteristics, taken together, describe a deposit that cannot have been produced by the kind of natural flood event that the standard framework invokes. Here is why. Natural flood deposits produced by river systems are variable by definition. The Mississippi-Missouri-Ohio system drains 31 states through thousands of tributaries, each contributing sediment with the specific mineralogy, particle size distribution, and organic content of its particular drainage area. A flood deposit from this system carries the compositional fingerprints of every contributing tributary. It is a mixture, a complex blend, a geologically legible record of every source area that contributed material to the event. It varies by region because the contributing sources vary by region. The gray-brown layer does not vary. It is the same from Ohio to Louisiana. It is the same from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. It has, in other words, the compositional signature of a single source rather than a multi-tributary mixture. It carries the fingerprint of one geological unit, mobilized in one episode, deposited across the full extent of the low-lying terrain it reached before its energy was exhausted. Single source. Single episode. Continental extent. That is the physical evidence for the single event claim. It is in the boring logs. It has been in the boring logs for 200 years. Nobody has assembled the boring logs and read them together. Until now, the evidence has been waiting in 19 state archives for someone to recognize that the annotations were, collectively, describing the same thing. Speaking of what a single source event at this scale would require, there is the geological mechanism that the standard framework has never modeled for this specific event. Seismically triggered liquefaction. The process by which saturated sediment loses its structural integrity under seismic loading and begins to behave as a fluid, flowing from its position under the influence of gravity and the pressure of the overlying water column. Liquefaction is not a theoretical mechanism. It is documented in the New Madrid seismic sequence itself. The sand blows visible in 19th-century survey reports of the affected region are its surface expression, columns of liquefied subsurface material ejected through the ground surface by the seismic pressure from below. But the documented sand blows are local. They are the visible surface expression at specific sites of a process that was occurring at scale across the entire saturated winter floodplain of the Mississippi Basin. Scale that process. Don't scale it incrementally. Scale it to the full extent of the basin under winter high water conditions, subjected to the largest seismic event in North American history over a period of weeks, with aftershocks continuing to mobilize already disturbed material. What mobilizes? The fine-grained sediment in the low-energy depositional zones of the interior basin, the material that has been settling in the slow-moving water of the floodplains for centuries, accumulating in the exact particle size range and mineral composition that characterizes the gray-brown layer. This material is the geological unit with the single compositional signature. When it liquefies under seismic loading and flows across the landscape under gravity, it deposits as a single compositional unit, uniform, because it all came from the same source, fine-grained because only the fine fraction travels far enough to deposit across a continental footprint, low organic because the organic fraction is lighter and separates from the mineral fraction during transport. The physical characteristics of the gray-brown layer are the predicted physical characteristics of liquefied fine-grained Mississippi Basin floodplain sediment deposited across the lowland terrain after a continental-scale seismic mobilization event. The prediction matches the observation. The match is the evidence. Which brings me to the timeline, because the timing of the layer's deposition is the second pillar of the single event claim and it is as solid as the first. Edmund Ravenel. 1843, The Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society. A naturalist surveying the Carolina lowlands who kept finding a layer of exotic silt, his term, at a consistent 3 to 5 feet depth, compositionally distinct from the local geology, not consistent with ordinary alluvial deposit. He described it as representing a catastrophic inundation of continental scale occurring within the memory of living persons at the time of his survey. Within living memory. In 1843. The outer boundary of reliable living memory in 1843 reaches back approximately 60 to 70 years for the oldest witnesses, to the 1770s and 1780s. But Ravenel specified a catastrophic event, not a gradual change. Catastrophic events are remembered with precision far beyond the normal horizon of living memory. People who were present for an event that transformed the physical landscape of their world in a matter of days do not forget the event or when it happened. The event Ravenel's living witnesses remembered pointed to the period around 1812. Which is the period of the New Madrid seismic sequence. Which is the event that produced the geological mechanism, seismically triggered liquefaction across a winter-saturated Mississippi basin, that the physical characteristics of the gray-brown layer require. Ravenel published this in 1843. His paper is in the American Philosophical Society archive in Philadelphia. It has been cited 3 times in 180 years. 3 citations. For a paper that identified a continental sedimentary anomaly, described its physical characteristics in terms that matched the boring log annotations, pointed to its probable cause with the phrase within living memory, and indicated a specific historical window that corresponds exactly to the largest seismic event in North American history. The evidence was published in 1843. The evidence has been in the boring logs since the first major construction projects in the eastern lowlands began producing geotechnical records in the 1840s and 1850s. The connection between Ravenel's living memory and the New Madrid sequence has been available to any researcher who read both the American Philosophical Society proceedings and the geological literature on the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes. Nobody made the connection in the published literature. The evidence waited. The part that keeps me up at night is not the missing geological study. It is what the single event deposit means for what was at ground level before it arrived. If the gray-brown layer was deposited in a single rapid event, and the uniformity requires this conclusion, then the layer is a seal. A continental seal, deposited fast enough across the lowland terrain of the eastern half of North America to preserve whatever was at ground level before it arrived. Not the gradual accumulation that gives structures time to deteriorate. A rapid covering that sealed them. And in excavations that go below the layer, boring logs deep enough to penetrate through it and examine what lies beneath, what appears is not ruins. It is rooms. Walls standing at full height. Stone floors intact and level. Architectural features preserved in the condition of construction rather than the condition of archaeological deterioration. The physical signature of rapid burial. In the Ohio River Valley, a field researcher named T.H. Mercer documented a multi-room stone structure with deliberate drainage channels cut into the stone floor at 23 feet depth and sent the documentation to the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology in October of 1879. The Bureau logged the receipt on October 22. The letter is not in the file. The Bureau dispatched no expedition. The site is now under a road built in 1923. In Philadelphia, a supervising engineer excavating the Centennial Exhibition site in 1876 found structures at 16 to 22 feet depth and used a specific technical term for what he had found. Pre-colonial. The report he submitted to the Fairmount Park Commission was received and noted in April of 1876. The report is not in the Fairmount Park Commission archives, the Philadelphia City Archives, or the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. In Cincinnati, the Hamilton County Engineer's Office filed a survey report on September 14, 1853, describing dressed stone at 18 feet depth, not locally quarried, standing rather than collapsed. The report recommended further investigation. No further investigation appears in the Hamilton County records. The wall was built over 3 discoveries beneath the gray-brown layer. 3 institutional responses that follow the same sequence: received, noted, not investigated, document subsequently not locatable. The seal above the discoveries held. The institutions above the seal did not look below it. There is a pattern in the grade-raising projects that the single event claim makes coherent for the first time. Chicago in the 1850s and 1860s. Seattle after the 1889 fire. Portland, Cincinnati, Memphis, New Orleans, each city in the lowland terrain of the eastern interior finding itself, within a relatively compressed historical window, needing to elevate its street level above the existing grade. Each project with its own local explanation: drainage, sanitation, post-disaster reconstruction, flood management. Each project raising its grade to a level that corresponds, with remarkable precision, to the top surface of the gray-brown layer. Not above the layer. Not to an arbitrary new elevation. To the surface of the layer. As if the cities were not creating a new grade but formalizing the grade that the event had already imposed, acknowledging, through the engineering process of grade raising, the new ground level that the single event deposit had established. The grade-raising projects of the mid-19th century are the administrative record of the aftermath of the single event. They are the institutional response to a landscape that had been permanently altered by a deposit whose origin the institutions were not asking about. They raised the grade to the top of the layer because the layer had defined the new practical ground level, and the cities needed to build at the level where the layer told them the ground now was. The single event came first. The grade-raising projects formalized what the event had done. The boring logs document the layer the event left. The archived documents describing what was beneath the layer, the pre-colonial structures, the multi-room stone buildings with drainage channels, the dressed stone walls at 18 feet depth, are the institutional record of the world that the event sealed. Maybe the uniformity has a natural explanation that the standard sedimentological literature has characterized and that I have simply not encountered. Maybe the Mississippi system produces compositionally consistent deposits across its drainage basin through mechanisms that specialists understand and that render the word uniform less anomalous than it appears in the boring log annotations. Maybe Ravenel's paper has been engaged in a specialist literature I have not accessed, his living memory reference properly contextualized, the continental inundation he described attributed to a known regional event. Maybe. 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 But the boring logs still say uniform. Across 19 states. In archives accessible to any researcher with the patience to request the right boxes and read the right annotations. Ravenel's paper is still in Philadelphia. Its 3 citations are still 3. The grade-raising projects still cluster in the same historical window. The structures beneath the layer are still at the depths where rapid burial put them. And the single event claim, the claim that the evidence has been supporting for 200 years in the white space of boring log annotations from 19 states, is still waiting for the geological study that assembles the distributed record into a coherent published argument. The evidence is the boring logs. The boring logs are in the archives. The archives are in 19 states. The study is in the gap between them and the researcher who finally reads them together and asks the question they have been collectively answering for 200 years. Here is the evidence, assembled. Physical characteristics: fine-grained, mineral-rich, low organic content, gray-brown coloration consistent with iron-rich fine-grained mineral sediment, compositionally uniform across a continental footprint where variation is geologically required by natural multi-source deposition. Geographic distribution: 19 states, for Canadian provinces, corresponding to the lowland terrain of the Mississippi-Missouri-Ohio drainage basin and adjacent coastal plain. Stratigraphic position: consistently below 19th-century urban fill and above geological subsoil, at depths ranging from 3 to 14 feet depending on local topography, with deeper deposits in floodplain terrain and shallower deposits on higher ground. Biological signature: low organic content throughout, suggesting material mobilized from depth rather than eroded from organic-rich surface soil. Historical documentation: described as exotic silt of continental-scale catastrophic origin within living memory by a naturalist in 1843, pointing to the 1811 to 1812 New Madrid seismic period. Geological mechanism: seismically triggered liquefaction of fine-grained floodplain sediment across a winter-saturated Mississippi basin during the largest seismic event in North American history, producing a single-source mobilization event with the predicted characteristics of uniform composition, fine particle size, low organic content, and continental geographic extent. Structural context: rapid burial of intact standing structures documented at depths consistent with deposition by this layer, in multiple independent excavation records across the affected geography. Administrative response: simultaneous grade-raising projects in multiple lowland cities in the same historical window, each raising grade to the surface level of the layer, formalizing the new ground level the event had imposed. That is the evidence. It is distributed across 19 state archives, the American Philosophical Society, the Smithsonian Institution Archives, the National Archives Record Group 49, and the engineering records of half a dozen American cities. It has never been assembled in a single published study. It has been waiting in the white space of boring log annotations for 200 years. The single event happened. The evidence says so. The boring logs say so. Edmund Ravenel said so in 1843. The grade-raising cities said so in the only language available to municipal engineers who did not ask geological questions. They raised their grades to the top of the layer and built above it, acknowledging in the language of construction what the geological literature has not yet said in the language of science. I don't have answers. Only evidence. Only a uniform gray-brown layer under every major city in the eastern half of North America, deposited in a single event that has no official name, pressing down on the world it covered with the patient density of 200 years of construction above it. The layer is there. The evidence is there. The single event is there in the physical record, waiting for someone to read the boring logs as what they are, not 19 separate state archives, but one distributed geological document, collectively describing one event, in the white space between bearing capacity adequate and proceed.